Hi, I'm Scott Mitchell at the Silver River Museum, and we're here in front of a map of Florida in the Spanish exhibit. And the reason we're here is because we're talking about physical features and cultural features. Now, the physical features in Florida really have not changed in the 500 years since the first Spanish explorers got into their ships and sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and came to what we call Florida today. In Florida, as 500 years ago, if you go west, you hit the Gulf of Mexico. If you go east, you hit the Atlantic Ocean. The Everglades are still there. The Florida Keys are still there. If you go far enough south, you hit an island called Cuba. If you go far enough north, up into Georgia and the Carolinas, you'll actually go up into the Appalachian Mountains. So the physical features of Florida are pretty much unchanged for the last 500 years. What has changed is cultural features. And as the population grew and as more and more people came to Florida, and as we invented new things like steamboats and railroads and automobiles, the cultural features that we find in Florida have changed dramatically over the years. So behind me is a map of Marion County from the 1890s. If we look at Ocala on this map, it shows up as a fairly confined square community. And if you look off to the east, you see Silver Springs, and down to the south, you see Bellevue, and off to the west, there's this place called Martell that I'm not even sure where that is anymore. But if you were to look at a modern map, Ocala has grown. More people have moved into Ocala, and the city limits have expanded out in all four directions. And it probably really almost looks like this now, where it takes up a lot more real estate. So some towns that were there in 1890, like Ocala, have expanded. Other towns have completely disappeared. When you think about the Wild West and ghost towns, you might picture a ghost town in your mind with a few old buildings off in the desert where no one lives anymore. Well, a lot of people don't know this, but we actually have ghost towns in Florida. Now, because we're not in the desert and the buildings weren't made of stone, they don't last, and we don't really see ghost towns in Florida. But there are places in Florida where there used to be towns, and for one reason or another, everybody left and the town disappeared, the buildings rotted and fell down, and the bushes grew up over it, and now it just looks like an empty field. Here's a great example. If you look out here, the western part of the county where Dunellen is, which is still there obviously, you go a little bit north of Dunellen, and on the map in 1890 there's a town called Juliet, and it's actually a pretty big town. It's near a place called Rock Springs. In 1890, Rainbow Springs was called Rock Springs. So here's Dunellen, here's Rainbow Springs, and here's the ghost town site nowadays of Juliet. Now, there were a bunch of farmers that lived in Juliet about the time of the Civil War, and by the 1890s, the farmers found a mineral called phosphate. And phosphate makes really great fertilizer, and they realized they could sell it. So phosphate mining became a very profitable industry all around the West Ocala or West Marion County area around Dunellen. Lots of people moved to Juliet because there were jobs in the phosphate mines, but the phosphate deposits in Juliet didn't last. So it really took off about 1890, but by the 1920s, the phosphate mines were running out of phosphate, and the mines began to shut down, and there was no work. By 1926, the post office closes. And when a post office closes in a small town, you can tell there aren't many people living there anymore because no one's getting the mail. So Juliet lasted from about the 1890s to about the 1920s, and it is a Florida ghost town. If you go there, you don't even see buildings anymore. These are some artifacts that are in the museum collections. And these are pieces of metal with little letters and words printed on them, and they're for a newspaper printing press. They would put ink on this, and there was a machine that would stamp it onto the paper, and they would make newspapers one after another. These are from about 1890 or 1900 from the town of Juliet. An archaeologist with a metal detector found them buried under the ground. And this small one, we actually inked it up and pressed it on some paper. They're printed in reverse, so they're very difficult to read, and the letters are tiny. I can't read what it says, but if you ink it and you stamp it on a piece of paper, you can read it. And this piece is a part of a newspaper article that talks about the number of libraries in the United States about 1900. So this steamboat in the picture behind me is on the Ocklawaha River, and it's probably coming from Palatka or Jacksonville heading to Silver Springs. Now, when it got to Silver Springs, you could get off the steamboat and get onto a train, and then you could go to Cedar Key or north towards Gainesville. The trains and the steamboats often met at places like Silver Springs, and that was a way for people to travel across Florida. Those modes of transportation created cultural features on the land. New towns sprung up, railroad lines were built, and it really changed the way people settled across Florida. And a map is a great way to study those ways of transportation. And if you look at this side of the map, this is the Ocklawaha River, and this is the Silver River. All along the rivers were the steamboat landings, and the destination was Silver Springs. Now, part of the reason they wanted to go to Silver Springs was because they would take tourists, and it was a beautiful place to go, and they could charge tourists money. It was a great way to make a living. But the other reason that the steamboats wanted to go to Silver Springs was because railroads met them at Silver Springs, and you could get off the boat and get onto a train and then keep going. So if you look at these dark lines on the map, these are not actually highways. Remember, this is 1890. They didn't even have cars yet. These are actually railroads. You can see why Ocala is there. Look at all of these railroads that meet in Ocala. They also go out to Silver Springs to meet the steamboats. So the cultural features from 1890 are very different from the cultural features today. The physical feature of the Ocklawaha and Silver Rivers are still there, but the cultural features of the railroads have changed, and many of them have disappeared. There's one or two railroad lines left, but they've been replaced with roads and interstates and neighborhoods. So the cultural features have changed as more and more people have settled and as the technology has changed. So we're here in the Silver Springs Schoolhouse. The Silver Springs Schoolhouse is a one-room school. That means that it's literally one room. There's no closets or restrooms or hallways. All the kids would go to school together in one schoolhouse with one teacher. The older students would actually help the younger students. Now, as the population in Marion County grew, there was a need for schools all across the county, but the population grew before the transportation networks were really in place. So there weren't lots of roads, families didn't have cars, and the school system did not have a big fleet of buses. So what they did was they built little schoolhouses like this all across Marion County and all the little farming communities. There used to actually be more schools in Marion County because of this. There were a couple of big schools in town and then dozens of these one-room schoolhouses located across the countryside. So schools can be considered cultural features. If we look at the area where East Marion Elementary is located now, East Marion Elementary, of course, doesn't show up on the map because it wasn't built in the 1890s. But what does show is about 6 of these one-room schoolhouses, at least in that general area. And remember, they didn't have buses running all over the place. So if you were a 4th grader in 1890 and you were lucky enough to go to school, you had to walk. And so they would build schools all over the county so the kids didn't have to walk too far. So in summary, physical features really don't change. If you think about big rivers like the Ocklawaha, or big lakes like Lake Weir, or Rainbow Springs, the name might change, but the spring hasn't. Those physical features remain the same, and they have for thousands of years. What does change are cultural features. And as different groups of people come and go in Florida, and as the technology changes, we invent new things, and as more and more people move to Florida, cultural features are sure to change. They have in the past, and they will in the future. As you're driving down the road and you look out across the countryside, think ahead 100 or 200 years. What will it look like in the future as the cultural features change? So thanks for joining me here at the Silver River Museum. I'll look forward to bringing you more cool history facts in the future as the school year progresses.